When I do the bake-offs, I often get questions like, how long did it take you? How do you bake 9 cakes in one day? What does it look like? So in case you've ever wondered, we recorded the baking of 9 coconut cakes in one day, and here's what it looked like. In this case, we started a little later than usual because we had to set up for the video, but I started around 8:45 a.m. with CHERYL Day's recipe. Her recipe starts by creaming together butter, sugar, and whole eggs before adding in the dry ingredients, which I always measure out the night beforehand so they're quick to add. Her batter is spiked with a tiny pinch of cardamom and its most unique feature, cream of coconut, which is this opaque, syrupy liquid that adds moisture, sweetness, and some coconut flavor. She also brushes the cake layers with a sweetened coconut milk syrup, which helps keep the layers super moist, and this cake is made even more rich with a shredded coconut filling that gives a lot of coconut flavor before being topped with a cream cheese frosting that uses coconut milk and topped with more shredded coconut. I had super high hopes for this cake. This video is showing things slightly out of order for continuity, but essentially it took me just under 15 minutes to make the CHERYL Day cake and get it in the oven. So then I moved to Sally's baking addiction, which starts with the same creaming method with butter and sugar. Sally's recipe was interesting because she uses egg whites instead of whole eggs, but luckily they don't have to be whipped to any kind of peak before being added. She adds sour cream for richness, which is one of my favorite cake ingredients because of the moisture it lends, and for coconut flavor she uses coconut milk, coconut extract, and shredded coconut in the batter. Now personally, the chunky texture of coconut in the batter is not my favorite, but it did lend a stronger coconut flavor if that's what you're looking for. Her cake gets topped with a cream cheese buttercream that uses coconut milk and extract for a subtle coconutty finish. Preppy Kitchen's cake is interesting because John uses the reverse creaming method. You can see here that I'm starting with the dry ingredients in the mixer before adding the butter. Once that gets worked into a crumbly texture, this means the butter has helped coat most of the flour, which helps inhibit gluten development and create a more tender cake. At this stage, you can add the liquid, in this case egg whites, milk, vanilla, and coconut extract to create the batter. John's recipe is actually almost identical to Sally's recipe right down to the cake flour. The main difference is the reverse creaming and the sour cream in Sally's cake. Although I was curious to see if the reverse creaming would make a big difference, it was hard to tell with the texture of the coconut in the actual cake. So all in all, this mostly tasted like a vanilla cake with a pretty coarse texture and a very light coconutty frosting. King Arthur is another cake that starts with the regular creaming method before adding egg whites and milk, which they specifically state should be at room temperature. Side note, whenever you're baking a cake, your ingredients should always be at room temperature so that everything emulsifies evenly rather than having chunks of cold butter in your batter from cold milk. The most interesting part of this recipe was the use of coconut milk powder, which they say gives just the right amount of coconut flavor, though they also offer a sub with full-fat coconut milk if you can't find the powder. This cake gets baked with either wet cake strips or in a pan of water if you don't have cake strips like me. To be honest, I'm not sure why this cake needed a water bath, and I think it was a bit unnecessary if the goal was just to make sure the cake baked up flat, which is the typical use for cake strips. In any case, this cake was actually slightly on the crumbly and dry side, and while both the cake and frosting used coconut milk powder, I didn't think either tasted very coconutty, but the sweetness of the frosting did a good job balancing the not as sweet cake. Cooking Classy also starts with the creaming method, but oil gets added to the mixture as Jacqueline uses a combination of butter for flavor and oil for a moist texture. Interestingly, Jacqueline uses just 2 egg yolks, however you'll add 6 egg whites later on. In case you're wondering what to do with the leftover yolks, I like to make a custard or lemon bars. Anyway, Jacqueline also uses cake flour like Sally and John for a tender texture, and finally, after the batter is mixed together, you'll whip the egg whites to stiff peaks and fold them in. Being gentle at this point is key so you don't deflate the egg whites. Jacqueline also uses a cream cheese frosting that has just a little coconut extract for flavor. Spoiler alert, this was my favorite coconut cake of them all because of its close creme yet light and fluffy texture. I found it just moist enough with a tangy frosting that balances the cake beautifully with the light coconut flavor. Okay, we're now almost 3 hours into baking and we're on cake number 6. Sugar Geek Show starts with toasting coconut until golden and letting it cool for later steps. Like Jacqueline, Liz starts her batter with the creamed butter and oil, though she uses coconut oil instead of vegetable oil, and also adds the egg yolks to the batter initially before later whipping the egg whites and folding the stiff peaks into the batter. Like Sally and John, Liz adds toasted coconut into the batter, which I was actually kind of excited about because I love the flavor of toasted coconut. Sugar Geek Show gets topped with a very similar frosting to Cooking Classy, and overall, this felt like a yellow cake with coconut mixed in. I actually didn't realize that some people don't like the flavor of toasted coconut until I got the reviews back on this cake, but just a note in case you were thinking about it. Brave Tart is, as always, the most unique of the bunch. She also starts by creaming butter, coconut oil, and sugar, but where she deviates most is her use of virgin coconut oil, which imparts a much stronger coconut flavor than refined coconut oil. She also supplements her all-purpose flour with some coconut flour, which requires more liquid as coconut flour is a really drying flour to bake with, so she adds a little over 2 cups of coconut milk. Stella's frosting was also very unique. It was the only Swiss buttercream style frosting with virgin coconut oil for flavor, turbinado sugar for a hint of molasses, which you can kind of see in the kind of caramely color, and it gets topped with toasted coconut. Although this is a lot of work to make, this was another of my favorite cakes. Peninsula Girl's recipe is supposedly based off the famous restaurant in Charleston where they make a 12-layer coconut cake with 5 components: cake, filling, frosting, a simple syrup, and a coconut creme anglaise. The cake itself is fairly simple with creamed butter, whole eggs, a strangely small amount of coconut oil, just 1 teaspoon, and the most interesting aspect, heavy cream for richness. After baking, I brushed it with the simple syrup for moisture and added the filling, which is made up of shredded coconut, heavy cream, sugar, butter, and cornstarch, which gets cooked together like a pudding. It gets topped with the plain cream cheese frosting and toasted coconut for a really sweet, really over-the-top decadent cake. It's 2:23 p.m. and we're on our last cake, Thomas Keller. Interestingly, Thomas doesn't use butter or oil. Instead, after whipping the sugar and egg yolks, you add the main fat source, mayo, one of my least favorite ingredients, along with coconut milk and buttermilk. This is another recipe where the egg whites get whipped separately before being pulled into the cake batter. This cake gets topped with an egg white meringue, which you make by whipping egg whites and slowly adding a hot sugar syrup until it whips into a shiny, sugary meringue. All in all, I enjoyed the process of making this cake about as much as I enjoyed eating it, which was unfortunately not very much. And that's the process of making 9 cakes in one day. I then sliced up all the cakes and served them to more than 30 tasters for them to taste and rank. For my full review of each cake, check out my tasting review video.